Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm returning to my stream with Kushin from Kushin's Gaming and playing Stellaris, a Paradox 4X strategy game that looks at sort of a futuristic space empire in the vein of Europea Universalis, but in space. And I'm sorry if I butchered that name. However, you're not going to hear Kushin in this video. You're not even going to hear myself. This was taken from a stream a couple of weeks ago. It was the second piece of my empire that I was starting to build, the second 30-minute segment of that stream. But what you're actually going to see here today is a discussion that I'm going to have around Paradox Interactive's financials, which they just recently reported. I know I'm not really a business channel per se, but I do think the business of gaming interests me quite a bit, and I thought you guys might care to hear about it, mainly because there's really two paragons of strategy gaming in the gaming industry. You have Slytherin slash Matrix Games, which is a privately held company based out of the UK, which publishes principally war games. They do a few other things. They've got their own 4X game, Distant World, or is it Distant Worlds? And then they have a couple of other space 4X games, but in general, they're a war game studio. They've got the Ajod studio as well with them. And then you have Paradox Interactive, which is a developer of grand strategy games, often with a war game theme. So, for example, Hearts of Iron is very much in the theme of a World War II war game. And they've released games like Crusader Kings, which is more of a 4X strategy game than a war game. But really, within strategy, those are the two gigantic, well, they're not really gigantic, especially Slytherin, but those are the two kind of principal players in the industry when it comes to publishing strategy games. There are certainly other game development studios out there. Game Labs is a brand new one. They're more in the development side, but they also act as a publisher at the moment, and they're doing some interesting stuff, but they only have a handful of games, and they've only been around for a little while. You've got companies like Firaxis, which is Sid Meier's company, but they're owned, I believe they're owned anyway, by 2K, which is a big kind of AAA studio, which doesn't really exclusively focus on strategy games. So it's hard for me to count Firaxis in there because they just don't, they put out Civilization, they've got a few other side projects that Sid does, but really they're a arm of 2K studios, and I wouldn't call them strategy exclusive because 2K does so many other things like NBA 2K, and you know, Civilization is a rather small piece of their business. But when it comes to companies that focus exclusively on war/strategy games, in terms of, you know, there being scale, there being staying power, they've been around for a while, there's really two companies, Paradox and Matrix and Slytherin. And I think it's obvious that Paradox is much bigger than Matrix Slytherin. I could be wrong there, but that's my assumption. But they recently went public, which gives us a little bit of a insight into the strategy gaming community. They went public back in May. They went public at 33 SEKs, that's the Swedish currency. They're based out of Stockholm, Sweden. And it is all the way up to, as of the moment of the recording of this video, 58 SEK. So it's almost doubled from its original IPO price. So it's been a very successful IPO to this point, approaching their 1-year mark on being publicly traded. But what them being publicly traded means for us strategy gamers, is we get an insight into the business of a strategy, more or less exclusive publisher and development studio, which we rarely ever get because generally the strategy space is so small that you don't see companies that really make their bank in the strategy space, because there's no reason for a privately held company to release their financial information. You know, we're kind of at the good graces of Matrix or Slytherin to tell us how a game does. They have no real obligation to tell us. But now that Paradox is publicly traded, they do have some obligations to tell their shareholders and the public at large how they're doing. And so this is the first year end of Paradox being a publicly traded company, so I wanted to talk about that for a little bit. If that's not something that interests you, please feel free to check off. It's going to be a lot of me reading numbers off of sheets and kind of talking about them, but I thought it would be interesting to take a look at. So, first off, Paradox had a phenomenal fourth quarter. And by the way, one other thing, they had a investor call, which all publicly traded companies have a call generally, where the CEO, sometimes the CFO, and other individuals in the company talk to investors, answer questions, present their perspective on the future of the business. And they had one of those actually on Twitch, and it was kind of a fun little affair. I mean, it was a much looser investor call than I've ever seen. I think I've mentioned this to you guys before. I'm by no means a savant when it comes to business, but I am closing in on completing my MBA, which is a master's in business administration. So, you've got your undergrad degree, which is your 4-year degree, and then if you want to get another degree beyond that, you've got a master's degree, which is considered, I believe, a professional degree. And then you've got a PhD, which would be kind of the pinnacle of degrees in the United States and globally. So I have my undergrad degree actually in history and international relations, but I started going to graduate school for business a couple of years ago part-time in addition to doing my day job and this as well, and I'm closing in on completing my degree with an emphasis in marketing. So this kind of information appeals to me. It's interesting. It's interesting seeing, a space that I'm a big fan of. Obviously, I play a lot of strategy games. I really enjoy strategy gaming, and it's interesting to me to see the business side of things, because again, we rarely see that. But that's enough of me rambling. We're 6 minutes in, and I haven't even really started talking about Paradox, so let's get back to that. So, first off, Paradox announced their fourth quarter earnings, as well as their year-end earnings. When you do year-end, you typically do fourth quarter as well. And we'll take a look at their fourth quarter first. These are just kind of the highlights that Paradox has provided. I'm more or less reading off their quick hits for the fourth quarter, but I thought it was kind of interesting. They had a phenomenal fourth quarter when you compare it to last year. So if you're not familiar with business, generally when a company releases their financials for a quarter, and remember, first quarter is January through March, second quarter is April through June, third quarter is July through September, and fourth quarter is October through December. So 3-month segments. You break the year up into 4 pieces. A quarter of the year makes sense, and that's what the fourth quarter is. It's the holiday season, right? So you go from October, which isn't that big of a shopping month, to November, which is one of the biggest shopping months, if not the biggest. I don't have the data in front of me, but you've got Black Friday, you've got Thanksgiving, you've got a whole bunch of sales that start toward the end of Thanksgiving, and then you've got December, which obviously the run-up to Christmas is a huge selling season. From Thanksgiving to Christmas, a lot of businesses make all of their profit. Literally, businesses stay in business because of those months of the year. It makes up a huge percentage, at least in the United States, of people's buying habits, and thus the fourth quarter is generally pretty important to most companies, and especially for entertainment companies that sell games. A lot of people buy games as gifts and things like that, so fourth quarter is particularly important, and Paradox had a phenomenal fourth quarter this year. So if you look at the revenues that they earned, so money that came into the business, they earned over $20 million that they received in revenue in the fourth quarter. That's a lot of money. And if you consider the fact that it's a 56% increase over that same period last year, that is a great sign for Paradox as a company. To increase your revenue from one year to the next in a holiday season by 56% is ridiculously good. You typically only see that in rapidly scaling companies, and obviously Paradox appears to be one of them. The reason that you compare it to the fourth quarter, just as an FYI, and not the third quarter, I'm sure you can see, but it doesn't make sense to compare it to the previous quarter when you consider that every quarter has different buying habits. It doesn't make sense to compare Thanksgiving and Christmas to the tail end of the summer and early fall. That's not really a one-to-one comparison in terms of people's buying habits. So you typically see when you talk about quarters, it's a comparison to the previous year at the same time. Sometimes it might seem a little bit odd when you're like, well, wait a minute, how'd they do last quarter? I'm curious to see what that trend line is. But really a more accurate comparison is looking at the fourth quarter of each year, because then you're looking at an apples-to-apples comparison, given that each part of the year has very different trends from a consumer perspective. Okay. Operating profit, so the amount of money they brought in, as a profit in the fourth quarter, within their operating revenue. So it doesn't include other investments that aren't part of their regular business activities. So if they invest in some third world country or something like that, and it's not part of their core business of selling games, it doesn't get included in here. But their operating profit had a 96% increase over last year. So $4.75 million in profit, 96% increase. They nearly doubled their profitability in the fourth quarter. Again, a phenomenal increase. In the investor call that you see there, they're talking about how their average margins are in the mid 20%, and their margin increased, all the way into the upper 40%. So the margin is the cost to sell the product versus the revenue that you bring in. That the percentage difference there makes up your margin. So they had a phenomenal year in terms of the margin on their products. That is reflected in the dramatic increase in their operating profit, which outstrips their increase in revenues. You'd think profits would increase in conjunction with revenue, 56% increase in revenue. You'd think a 56% increase in profits, but that's not necessarily the case. If you have to spend less to get someone to buy the game, you need less marketing, you need fewer sales. Those kinds of things can drive down the cost of the game and allow you to increase your profitability at a greater rate than you increase your revenue. Profit before taxes was another big increase from $3 to $4 million. Cash flow, so the amount of money that they bring in, not necessarily profit per se. They had a very good cash flow this year. All told, they ended up having over $27 million in cash or short-term investments quickly convertible to cash, so basically over $27 million in the bank. They had earnings per share of about 7 cents, so every share that they had publicly traded, they made roughly 7 cents on the dollar, which was another big increase because in the fourth quarter of the year before, they only had about 4 cents per share in earnings. And by the way, I'm converting all of this from Swedish currency to US dollars, so there may be some discrepancies in some of my figures, but it should all be relatively close. So that's a pretty strong quarter. During the fourth quarter, they indicated that the majority of their revenue was made up from sales of Cities Skyline, Stellaris, which you're seeing in front of you, Hearts of Iron 4, the new World War II strategy game, Europea Universalis 4, and Tyranny. I find Europea Universalis 4 being a key component to their revenue driver for 2016 is probably due to the fact that they released a new DLC. I believe it was Rights of Man. But that's interesting still that you see a game from 2013 still being a key contributor to the business of Paradox some 4 years or 3 years after it was released. That's really encouraging to see. Paradox has, because of their DLC model, they seem to tend to be able to drive substantial revenue from products for a much longer period of time than most computer game developers. A lot of computer game developers, they make almost all the money from their game in the first 6 months. Paradox, obviously in the case of Europea Universalis 4, is still making substantial revenue if it's one of their key revenue drivers in Q4, 3 years after it came out. Jumping back to full year 2016 results, their full year revenues were just over $70 million at $72 million for all 2016, an 8% increase over the year. So you can see, in contrast, Q4 was a huge improvement for them relative to the rest of the year. Profits amounted to a 27% increase. So again, their margins were very strong for the year. Their profits before taxes were around $34 million, and after taxes were factored in, they still saw a $26 million profit for the year. Their earnings per share equaled 25 cents for the year, which is, again, very strong to see a company that at the time was not paying a dividend to have that strong of an earning per share in the first year of them being public. And they also indicated that they'll be paying an 11 cent per share dividend. So if you were a shareholder and you owned 10 shares in Paradox, you would receive $1.10 just for owning those stocks. That being said, that's always encouraging to see a company issuing dividends to their shareholders. It tends to increase the value of the stock, but it also indicates the company's confident that they have more revenue than they need to continue operating. The fact that they had over $26 million in profit after taxes for 2016 indicates a very strong year. All told, a very strong year for Paradox. I think if you look at Paradox's performance, you have a couple of key drivers to that performance in 2016. Obviously, Stellaris coming out was huge for them. It was their fastest game ever to sell 200,000 units and did very, very well. You then had Hearts of Iron also come out in 2016 for another game that reached 200,000 units. And actually, they recently announced that it had hit over They had recently announced that Hearts of Iron has hit 500,000 units sold. That's at a conservative $20 per unit. I think they're selling it for $40 right now. But, assuming sales and other markdowns and currency conversions, if they're selling that at $20 a unit, that's $10 million in revenue. Even if Steam gets a cut of that, that's a solid revenue driver right there. Just from one of their games, over 500,000 units sold, hasn't even been out a year yet, which, again, it may not sound like a lot when you compare it to games like Call of Duty or other AAA games, but those are billion-dollar companies driving billions of revenues every year, companies that have those games. In this case, Paradox, a strategy game driving over $600 million of revenue in a single year, paying a dividend to their shareholders, having one of their new games come out, selling more than 500,000 units. That's really encouraging. And they seem to be seeing substantial revenue still from Cities Skyline, which is also another, cash generator for them. I think it will be very interesting to see how Paradox does going forward in 2017. If you look at the investor call, which I've linked in the description, it's on Twitch. They don't say this, but they kind of indicate the margin that they have here. Their 40% plus margin on their goods sold in 2016 is probably not sustainable. At least they're not confident that it's sustainable, which kind of makes me think if they're indicating they overperformed there, I would not be surprised to see 2017 be a little bit of a down year. Not necessarily, a bad year per se, but I wouldn't expect to see, 50% growth in sales in 2017, especially when you consider they had two internal Paradox games come out in 2016, Stellaris and Hearts of Iron. I'm not sure what would come out in 2017. Cities Skyline's probably selling too well for them to move on to a sequel. You'll definitely get DLC for Stellaris, for Hearts of Iron, probably for Cities Skyline, but I don't know what that next game is that's coming for them. EU4 and Crusader Kings are both probably on the tail end of their life cycle, with Crusader Kings being over 5 years now. I think there's been some indication that they probably got one more DLC in them, but that's not going to drive the kind of success they had this year. Tyranny released, I believe, toward the tail end of last year, and they've also got some projects going on in China where they have a distributor in China that's starting to sell some of their games over there, localizing them in the Chinese language. I think it'll be really interesting to see how those play out, given that, most people know China has had sort of a history of not respecting intellectual property, and how do you operate in an environment where, people are more apt to pirate your game, than buying it. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. Actually, the company that they worked with ended up buying a minority stake in Paradox. So they're certainly committed to making the partnership work, but we'll see. China could be a large revenue stream for them as they start to introduce more games in the market, or it could be a bit of a sideshow and a bit of a distraction. Only time will tell. As far as, and I believe they said Stellaris is coming out in China later this year. As far as kind of going forward, they didn't give a ton of kind of hints for what's going forward. They mentioned a couple of intellectual properties that they purchased, some wolf thing that I had not heard of before myself. They fielded some questions about, like, when's the Paradox board game going to come out, or when are you going to get bought out by someone else? And they kind of, the board game, they indicated it was something they'd like to do, but they haven't really been able to kind of figure out how they would do it. It doesn't sound like there's anything on the imminent horizon with that. Being bought out, they actually indicated they're interested in purchasing other companies, which was kind of interesting because they haven't outright bought another studio, at least not since they've been public. So they're indicating that they're open to, mergers and acquisitions, which, again, with all this money they have on hand, makes sense. It's just a question of who would they acquire. They indicated they're really interested in game companies that make hardcore games and are really serious about their, high-quality products with really good cultures. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means like a small startup like Game Labs. It seems unlikely to me. They've only got 3 games out there now. And they're probably too new, right? I just don't see the value that Paradox brings to acquiring them. There certainly could be some smaller studios out there. I'm not sure. Maybe a mobile studio. They indicated that they're looking at getting into the mobile market. They're doing some research there. They hired someone from King, which I believe King was the developer of Candy Crush. Correct me if I'm right. But they also sort of indicated they're looking at getting into mobile, but they don't want to do the same things everybody else is doing. They kind of want their own Paradox model on mobile, which will be interesting to see. I mean, if we're honest, mobile lately doesn't seem to be panning out nearly as well as people had hoped. The market seems oversaturated. It's really hard to get discovered. It takes Steam times 1,000. And, I think there's a bit of a hesitancy. People buy a shit ton of in-app purchases, which could work well for the DLC sort of mantra of Paradox. On the flip side of that, I don't know what value they bring to mobile specifically. They want hardcore games, but they want them on mobile. You could probably do a CK on mobile, but I'm curious how that would play out and if that's something people would spend money on. I mean, the difficulty that you face on mobile is generally people aren't going to spend $20, $30 on a game. So if you're a game studio that makes your living by selling games at $30 or $40 and then, occasionally discounting them very heavily, how do you get involved in the mobile market and do so successfully? They're analyzing it, they're investigating it, they're certainly interested in doing it, but thus far they haven't indicated any plans for it. So I think, what we can look for is Paradox perhaps to be looking to expand to other platforms, perhaps other countries. They mentioned maybe the Middle East, maybe Turkey, some other countries where they haven't sold before. They're obviously starting to get into China, so they're looking at making themselves more availably globally. But what does that really mean for Paradox going forward? What does it mean for us as gamers playing Paradox games? I don't know if we got a really good sense. It sounded like they're pretty much sticking up for their DLC policy. There was a question that someone asked in the investor call pertaining to the DLC path they go, and they kind of, they naturally defended it. They made the argument that players get a lot of patches for free, whether they buy anything or not, and the game experience from when EU came out 3 years ago to what it is now would be totally different for someone who didn't even own any DLC, which they're right, but still tends to be a little bit of a contentious issue with some of their followers. One of the companies they acquired the brand to is Werewolf the Apocalypse from Focus Home Interactive. So basically they have the right to publish this game on PC and consoles. So they're working, it sounds like, to get this on consoles, which I don't know if that's Xbox or PlayStation or what, and also on PCs. They didn't seem to indicate it was coming out soon. I'm not familiar with the brand. But yeah, they're going to be holding their own Paradox convention in Stockholm, I believe it was. So maybe that's a way to bring in some additional revenue by holding a Paradox-specific convention. You can sell tickets to that, bring in revenue, and every ticket is probably the equivalent of a game sale. And then maybe sell some merchandise and equipment there, but at best that brings in a couple million. But hey, that might be the equivalent of a moderately successful game, outside of their core stable. I'd be interested to see if Vicky 3 maybe is in the pipeline. We haven't heard anything about that, but that's the next sort of core product in their IP that they haven't really touched in a while. Again, I mentioned CK and EU are kind of on the way out, so we'll probably look to see a new one of those at some point in the not too distant future, but I'm guessing we're still talking at least a year, 2, 3 years out for that. Given that they're still making DLC now. They just released Stellaris, so you'll probably see some DLC there, but outside of that, I guess I'm really curious to see what Paradox does this year to shake things up. Now that they're a publicly traded company, they have certain obligations to pursue they have less flexibility to pursue long-term strategy and more requirements to ensure that they're providing maximum value for their shareholders. I think they still hold the majority of the company in-house, so they have some more flexibility there than a lot of companies would. But it'll be interesting to see going forward, because they do have to reveal a lot of this. They do have to talk about some of their plans, and thus far they tend to release at least one of their intellectual property games every year. This year was last year was Stellaris and Hearts of Iron. They mentioned that was kind of a first for them to have two come out in a year. I believe City Skyline was 2015, if I'm not wrong. So I'm trying to think of what came out in 2014. But 2017 could either be a really exciting year, maybe we'll see a Vicky 3, or it could be a little bit of a, Paradox kind of taking a breather and kind of deciding what they want to do, charting their course forward. Either way, it'll be really interesting to watch. Long story short, I know this is me sort of rambling for a bit, but it seems like they're doing really well. It seems like 2016 was a really good year for them. 2017 is off to a good start, with Hearts of Iron getting to its 500,000th unit sold. I'm excited to see what happens with them. I hope they don't lose focus and start to become short-sighted in the way that a lot of companies are, but they don't seem to be on that path. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in Paradox, if you're interested in the business, go ahead and check out the live stream here. I don't think I did a great job of presenting this information, but I do hope that you enjoyed the video, and I'll throw the link in the description if you want to check out the actual stream that was provided by Paradox's CEO and CFO. I certainly didn't provide any amazing insight here. I just kind of summed it up and provided it to an audience that probably missed it, I'm guessing, but I also think, you guys may be interested to see this. If this was a state of the strategy gaming universe, it seems, at least in the case of Paradox, that the union of strategy gamers is strong, and that the future for Paradox Interactive thus far appears to be bright. Hopefully that rosy financial situation is the same across the industry, and that other strategy gaming studios are similarly doing well, but we have no real way of knowing because, again, Paradox is really the only key strategy gaming studio that is privately held or publicly held. I am really interested to see if they make any mergers and acquisitions. I think that could be an interesting way forward for Paradox, but who would they acquire? I don't know. Who's interested in even being acquired, or who's in a financial situation where that would be something they'd be either benefiting from or maybe looking to exit the market? I don't know. There's just not enough players out there to know, unless we're talking some really small studios that only have 1 or 2 IPs, which is probably a more affordable way to go for Paradox. But again, where are they going to acquire? I have no idea. Anyway, guys, that's enough of me rambling. That's enough of me kind of repeating myself. Let me know your thoughts below. I'm interested to see if you guys are interested in kind of these almost podcast-like discussions around the industry. Again, this video here was taken from a live stream that I did with Kushin. This is part 2 of my Let's Play with Kushin playing Stellaris. Again, a Paradox game. I'll go ahead and add this to the playlist for that series. And again, next time we'll probably just go back to hearing Kushin and I bicker about things and Trump and whatever. Anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts below. And with that being said, until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.